The Israel-Palestine conflict is once again at the center of global attention, and the role of Western media in shaping public perception and opinion about this protracted struggle is under scrutiny. The Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership, each backed by their respective echo chambers, present their own version of events and perspectives. However, the role of a large section of Western media in this context often becomes a point of contention, as some argue that it has not always provided a fair and objective portrayal of the situation. To delve into this issue, we are joined by Vanessa Beeley, a British independent investigative journalist who has worked extensively in the Middle East. Vanessa has reported from conflict zones in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, and Yemen. Her investigative reports have often challenged mainstream Western media narratives, which has ironically made her a target of Western media's smear campaigns. Vanessa is joining us from Damascus. Welcome to CGTN, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for inviting me on.
How do you see the coverage of the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict in the Western media?
Well, I mean, we're seeing what we've seen consistently for the last 20 years. We're seeing the protection of a Western ally in the region in West Asia, which of course is the Israeli settler state, predominantly, of course, governed by a Zionist far-right extremist government that 2 weeks ago the media was describing as far-right and extremist, and warning of an eruption from the Palestinians because of the amount of persecution, provocation that was being carried out by this government, including, of course, the continued siege of the Gaza Strip, which is a strip of land 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers, which is effectively a concentration camp. So the media was warning of this upcoming insurgence, and then when it happens, suddenly we see them describing it as unprovoked and condemning the Palestinian resistance and framing the operation as a terror attack. So it's very clear to me that what we see now is an ongoing connection between the media and Western and Israeli foreign policy.
As you mentioned, a large section of the Western media has been accused of biased and at times even running a propaganda campaign to suit a one-sided narrative. Can you share your insights into the root causes of this media bias and the spread of disinformation in these conflict zones in the Middle East?
We have not only really media, we have an entire misinformation complex that is working to justify globalist aggression. And by globalist, of course, I mean led by the US, the UK, and the EU, and their various alliances globally. And so therefore, the media is no longer, let's say, speaking truth to power. It's protecting power from truth. And of course, we've seen that if we go back to the first Iraq invasion, we saw, of course, the incubator story that justified in Western public perception the need for an invasion. We saw, for example, in Libya, the Benghazi rape stories. In Afghanistan, the West entered Afghanistan to protect women's rights. Well, if we look at Afghanistan now, where are women's rights? If we look at the second invasion and the obliteration of much of Iraq and the colonization of Iraq, of course, that was on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, which is a proven discredited story, but that doesn't matter. The media basically erased any challenge to the dominant narrative in order to serve American foreign policy. In Syria, of course, we have the weapons of mass destruction, which are the chemical attacks, all of which have been vociferously debunked by analysts, including, of course, the Duma chemical attack in 2018. But this is the thing, that the context is completely obfuscated by media in the West, by the legacy media, in order to protect globalist ambitions and globalist agendas.
So in the current conflict, we also saw how a horrific and unsubstantiated claim by apparently a random Israeli soldier accusing Hamas of beheading children went viral, with even US President Joe Biden amplifying the fake news. The White House had to issue a clarification later. What do you make of this incident in particular? And do you notice a pattern in such disinformation campaign?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is that all of these narratives that were pushed out by mainstream media very early on in the first 24 hours of the operation, and what they actually are designed to do is to force people to rush to judgment, right? So almost immediately they lay the foundations of the narrative. So they lay the foundations that Hamas is a terrorist organization that is beheading babies, raping women, killing innocent party goers, etc. And then only after time do we receive the retractions, but the retractions are very muted compared to the amplification of the initial vilifying narratives against one faction. And of course, the baby narrative was retracted, the rape narrative was retracted, but none of this context is given. And as I said, when a story is retracted, that retraction is not amplified. So what happens is that initial propaganda gathers traction and remains in people's consciousness. They remain in public consciousness because the media is not there to educate. The media is there to manipulate.
So in the same line, I think we also saw two contradictory claims on the Gaza Baptist Hospital bombing that killed hundreds of civilians, including children. And rather than backing just one side, shouldn't the US and the West be demanding an international inquiry into the heinous attack?
Absolutely, of course they should. If whenever they enter into a conflict, either by proxy or directly, of course, since the Iraq war in 2003, the US has been less inclined to put its own boots on the ground. It's been inclined to use its terrorist proxies. And we have a very similar situation with the Baptist Hospital story, in the sense that even mainstream media initially was saying it's not possible that it could be a Palestinian missile. It wouldn't cause this much damage and these many casualties. And we know that the IDF has previously bombed hospitals in every single aggression against the Gaza enclave. And then suddenly we started to see it switch, right? I mean, even Naftali took responsibility for Israel bombing the area around the hospital. But again, we've seen this in every previous Israeli aggression. What happens is that the media creates enough confusion and gets everybody arguing over who has responsibility. And in that way, they distract from the other atrocities that Israel is committing under the cover of this international argument that's going on in the media and in the so-called international community. This is a very familiar tactic, both by Israel and by the West, and then, of course, supported by the aligned media. These days, I don't see the media as an independent entity in the West. It has connections to the intelligence agencies, to the security agencies, and to the government. And as I said, it is basically completely controlled by those agencies.